Just give us an explainer, if you would, because people have been seeing these images emerge from Iran of women removing their headscarves, burning their headscarves, protesting. And this all comes after the death of one woman who was accused of not wearing her headscarf in the correct manner. So just give us an explainer of why this is happening now.
Well, I think the problems within Iran have been brewing for a very long time. You know, there has been 4 decades of suppression of women's rights, and human rights violations. But I think in the aftermath of the pandemic and the economical and financial pressure that the country is now under and the hardships that people are going through, and with the amount of failed attempts in uprisings that have happened in the past, after the rigged elections back in 2009, and after the Green Movement, after the crash of the Ukrainian flight in Iran, there were all these small uprisings, but I don't think there is much other than a cruelty to a helpless woman that could unite an entire nation in their belief system, because Iran is a really big country. To unite everyone with the same cause is very difficult. And to know that this Mahsa could have been someone's sister, someone's daughter, someone's wife, and the absolute sheer brutality of what's happened, everyone across the country and across the globe, as we've seen in the last 10 days, can relate to how little women have a say in what happens to them in Iran.
I saw an interesting video of some Iranian women on public transport. I assume it was a train, and they had removed their headscarves, and on the train there were women who were veiled, and they were explaining that they felt it was important for female rights, for women's rights, that they shouldn't be forced to wear the headscarf. Just explain what the sentiment is, because the rules under Islamic law, as I understand it, in Iran require a woman to be veiled when they are out in public. So what has been the change that women have been saying or started to say? We are not going to follow that rule.
I think the complaint, the frustration has always been there. I grew up in Iran myself, and I remember, when you grow up in Iran from the age of 7, you are forced to wear head covering in a public environment. So the argument is that as young as a 7-year-old girl could potentially seduce a man and distract them into sexual thought. And I think that's sick. I think no religion supports that. And I think this is it's a very social construct that is about control and it's not about religion. There are many religious countries around the world that go by the Islamic laws, but don't force their women to wear head covering. I think it's a very personal choice. And it's when it becomes law that it becomes suppression. I remember myself when I was out in Iran once and I was wearing my headscarf, and you could just, as you can see, I have very big hair and it's very hard to hide it sometimes. And some guy, one of the morality police, actually slapped me in the back of the head and said to me, "Can you sort out your tail?" Which in translation in Farsi, it doesn't mean ponytail, it means the tail of an animal. So he was basically reducing me to that status, saying, "I can see your hair and therefore you're an animal."
How old were you?
So I would have been 16. So, and that is nothing compared to what happens to other women who go out. And I remember when I used to go out with my brother just for a coffee, and if my hair was showing, we had to have our birth certificates on us to show that we are brother and sister, and that I'm not trying to seduce him with two strands of hair showing. And they would, it's very difficult on the families, because you can have your daughter go out to buy bread and they won't come back home, and you have to go and pay bail to get them out because they have an offense because their hair was showing. I wouldn't call that freedom of choice. It's not anything to do with Islam. I think it's just control, and it's also a way of making money, because a lot of the times when these people are detained for having shown their hair, for nail varnish, showing a bit of their arm, you pay them off as well. So it not only that, they make money from the fines.
It's interesting that you talk about freedom of choice, because there will be women around the world who say they wear the hijab, or in some countries a burqa, out of choice, out of religious choice. But what you're saying is that women in Iran simply don't have that choice. I was interested to see as well that there are female morality police. I didn't realize that.
Yes, there are, because by Islamic law, men aren't actually allowed to touch women or detain women. So in prisons, in detention centers, women deal with women. So if you're not married or related to a woman in Iran, you're not allowed to touch them. So that's why they employ other women, and these are mostly people who are within the government, family, friends of the government officials, or simply people of more unfortunate or poorer backgrounds who have no choice but to hold these jobs. Or it could be the result of 4 decades of brainwashing of women who are very impressionable from when they were born and are told that this is what is right. And if you think in Iran, there are places that are so poor that the entire village doesn't have a TV, or they have one radio, or so very, very impressionable places that if you are given a job, you would embrace it regardless of what it is, and you would take it seriously.
It's very difficult to actually talk to anybody who is currently in Iran and to get them to go on the record and explain what they're doing and why they're holding these protests, because it is a danger to them. We have seen, or rather we have heard, that the internet has been cut in recent days at different times. What are you hearing from those that you have contact with in terms of the scale of these protests and whether there is increasing support or not for them?
There definitely is an increase in protests. People of Iran have become very good at finding proxies, VPNs, and ways to bypass the internet blocks. So there are a lot of people that are working outside Iran to make this possible. And I have a lot of friends in Iran who are posting a lot on their Instagrams and Twitter, and trying to promote ways that they've discovered to bypass all these internet blockages. And I actually saw recently that a few of my friends were saying that they're going to move the protest hours from the predictable times, so after hours between 5-6 p.m. till 12 a.m., to early mornings, because that's when there are less armed forces around, and they try to surprise with surprise locations. So it's actually becoming more strategized, and people are becoming more and more hopeful in what they've started. So I really do hope it doesn't fizzle out. And what we can do outside Iran is also to promote and not to let it die, because it's a very good opportunity to finally get what the women deserve over there.
We'll talk a little bit more about what you would like to see from the British government in terms of their response to this in a moment. But I just want to focus on the dangers that women are putting themselves in, because this has increased since the death of one woman, but there have been many more, haven't there?
There has been 60 official deaths, I think, since I've checked. I mean, this figure could change, but I know of many women who have died. One woman, Hadith Najafi, was shot 6 times in the head, and there is actually a very heartbreaking video of her last video that she posted, which is her saying that she's going to this protest because she wants to look back on this in the future, and say that she was also part of the change that happened to make this possible. And that's the last video of her before she was shot. And when she did die, her family wasn't informed until she was dead. And even when she was dead, her family wasn't allowed to see her body, and they were coerced into saying that she died of a heart attack because of stress and fear. Her mother was only allowed to see her daughter for 4 seconds before she was buried, because the guards wouldn't let her see her daughter because they didn't want her to see that she was shot. So I think this is horrific. I think the fact that they are killing girls, and these girls are voluntarily going to these protests knowing the risks, knowing that they can be killed. But the level of desperation and frustration for the rights that should be given to them by birth is so high. That frustration, the anger is so much that they risk death going to the streets. And imagine the turmoil of their parents, because they know that their children are going out to these protests and they might not come back. And some people are being arrested and no one knows where they are. They don't hear from them again. They don't know whether they're dead, if they're being detained, or if anyone will ever hear from them ever again.
Are these women of all ages, all backgrounds?
Yes, it's mainly the younger generation, so girls between the ages of 18 and I would say 30. I've seen older women as well, but there was actually a 15-year-old child who was killed in the protests as well. So there have been victims of all ages, but mainly younger women.
And we've seen images as well, not just of women removing their headscarves and burning their headscarves, but also cutting their hair. What's the symbolism, the significance of doing that?
I mean, cutting your hair as a woman, I think, is a very brave act in itself, or any culture, because when you have very long hair, it's a very heartbreaking thing to cut your hair. I know, because I've done it. But it's I think it's a sign of bravery, solidarity, and strength. I think showing your hair is one thing, but to stand on a podium and actually cutting your hair, it really strengthened that bond between women around the world. I've seen women in Syria doing it. I've seen, I think, some New Zealand officials in New Zealand doing it, and people around the world, in Vancouver, in Australia. And it's an act that unifies all women in terms of bravery. So I think that's why, because people who aren't from Iran, showing their hair is not a brave act. It's just daily, a normal occurrence. But to cut your hair, that's showing solidarity, and not something everyone would do.
What would you like to see from the British government? Your father was held in Iran, detained in Iran for 5 years, in prison there, and released earlier this year along with Nazanin Zagahri Ratcliff. So you have some understanding on a personal front what it is like when someone is detained in Iran. These women, as you've explained, are being detained and held. What response would you like to see from the British government?
Any response at this point. I think the British government have been deathly quiet, and I find it shameful. And to think that they have expressed their views on other issues in the past, like the war on Ukraine, which is ongoing and it's still very much in the news, regarding George Floyd's murder, a lot of discriminative acts that British government had an opinion on. But seeing that so many people and so many countries have joined together in raising awareness of what's happening in Iran, including the US, Canada. I think Canada has actually recently strengthened the sanctions on Iran and tightened, the sanctions on some of the government officials as well. Australian government, a lot of influencers, a lot of very big names have all come to support the Iranians, and the British government hasn't even made a single tweet. They haven't acknowledged anything, and I find that shameful, not as a government and not as humans or for politics, but the fact that our prime minister is a woman, and that as a woman, she has not had any opinion or reaction on this matter, and it's been 10 days. I find it baffling.